haven't got time to waste. Very compassionate, giving you no choice. It's only 1,500 words, it's nothing. Just, if you see it clearly, the essay will just write itself. It's no accident that this week's on initiation, as the essay topics come out. Birth, death in order to be reborn, rites of passage. It's in effect a theme that we've already had, but we'll be looking at it through stories. An account of Aboriginal initiations in Ekalavya. This week's really about law, but maybe in a slightly different sense than Socrates meant at LAW. One of the things the Australian Aborigines say about their initiations is their purpose is to awaken the boys to the law. Awaken the boys to the law. Reminiscent of the Greek word for truth. Awakening to what was forgotten or not seen or was oblivious. This sort of image of awakening. I mean, Mary Magdalene is one way of reading her story is something happens when she sees Jesus and she's just awakened to the life she's been leading and that there has been transgression. She's been breaking the law. Thou shalt not interdicts. In other technical terms, Durkheim, sociologist, uses interdicts and remissions. I'll be talking about those in a moment. If coming here this morning, coming up the stairs, and you pass, suddenly someone lashes out and punches a student going past, and you're close by, you see this, it puts you on edge with it. Partly violence, partly not knowing whether to intervene or not. Difficult decision if you've got to know nothing, assume you know nothing about the incident, what lies behind it, if anything. But a lot of your unease would be the sense, the sort of generalised sense that this is unjust. Some sort of violation of law is happening here. Something that's happening that shouldn't happen in a moral sense. And there is a sort of universal law, you'll find it in all human societies, which goes something like, thou shalt not harm another human without due cause. It's phrased in very different ways, depending on the society. Thou shalt not harm another human without due cause. But it's a thou shalt not. It includes thou shalt not steal. I mean, it's a way of theft, it's a way of harming someone without due cause. Now, a number of sociology courses will teach you, those of you who have the fortune or misfortune to be students of sociology, that morality is always relative and it varies from society to society. That's rubbish. Absolute rubbish. There are universal moral laws, the big ones. The thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not harm another human being without due cause. Thou shalt not deceive about very important things. Thou shalt not lie about important matters. I'm not talking about white lies. These are interdicts. Thou shalt not. I mean, unless the society's really collapsed, the culture's collapsed, you'll find universality to the main ones, not the sort of minor laws, which vary a lot from society to society. And just as the sense of unease with that sort of maybe unprompted violent act that you see coming up the stairs today arouses a sense of law is being violated. Yep. What does vary from society to society are the remissions. Every moral code We're talking about every human society, as I said. Every human society has a moral code, it wouldn't function otherwise. A series of thou shalt nots, laws, major and minor. But in all societies there are excusing reasons where it is permitted to break the law. There are circumstances under which it is permitted to break the law, remissions, that excuse you from... in every human society there are circumstances in which it's permitted to kill. In war, defending territory, obviously. But these will vary. In our society, infanticide, killing babies, is absolute thou shalt not. There are a number of other human societies, including Australian Aborigines, where infanticide is quite common. There would have always been an excusing reason. Nomadic peoples in the deserts with too many children, survival depends on mobility and being able to move. Too many children threatens the survival of the clan. In the Australian Aboriginal case, there were circumstances of killing or leaving old people to die. In effect, killing them because of the survival of the clan. They were too slow. They were holding everybody up. The getting of food, movement, the getting of food required this. So remissions, when you do courses in sociology that tell you that all morality is relative, that societies create their own morality, what they do create is the remissions, the excusing reasons which permit us to break. And there are a lot of, usually, debates about remissions, especially in our society. Peter Singer's played a role in debates about deformed babies and whether it's permitted to kill them or euthanize them to be more polite. Whether that's breaking a fundamental, whether breaking an absolute thou shalt not or not. And as you're coming up the stairs this morning, you see someone punched or hit. We're going through your own minds. Maybe he's got good reason. Last night he found his girlfriend sleeping with someone else, or you don't know. It will be going through your own mind, but maybe there are excusing reasons for this act. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. Is that clear? We're sort of going a bit indirectly into initiation this morning because these are sort of fundamentals that we need to clear up before we proceed further. Let me give you another example. 18-year-old girl, woman, driving down a suburban back street in Melbourne, a place like this. She's not speeding, sunny afternoon, 3-year-old boy runs in front of her car and is killed. She's completely devastated and flattened for 6 months, probably the rest of her life. It's under a sort of shadow because of this. She wasn't culpable. She hadn't had anything to drink. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't charged by the law because she wasn't culpable. 3-year-old boy just ran out in front of her car. If she's not culpable, why does she feel so bad in this sort of situation that we could all put ourselves in?
She still was the cause of his death, whether she was responsible or not.
Is she guilty for his death? Is it guilt that she's feeling? She's absolutely right, of course. She's the agent for something terrible, a bit like a search is a violation. Something terrible has happened. The death of a child, an innocent, it was a human death. The fact it's a child's death makes it worse or more extreme. Is she feeling guilt? She hasn't broken any laws, has she? She hasn't broken the law of the state of Victoria. The police have not charged her.
The moral universal law, thou shalt not kill. Morally.
But it's an accident.
Sorry?
It's an accident.
Yeah.
She has killed, it's true, but I mean, it's the last thing she would want to do. I mean, she spends, we can assume, day after day rethinking, if only I hadn't been driving there, if only, if only, if only, as we all would. I think we'd all think there was something wrong or inhuman about her if she didn't feel bad, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
Mm.
So, putting ourselves in her position, and it looks like guilt.
Mm.
It looks, she's feeling terrible guilt, as if she's committed murder. It's as if, well, she hasn't. If she's feeling guilt, it means she feels she's broken some very, very serious moral law. Thou shalt not kill, or is this something else going on here? We started fast, so it is coming. It is very disruptive when you come late. This he's fled now. He's not half-hearted. Guilt? What's going on?
I think there's a difference between the guilt of breaking a rule and the guilt of the acts that you participated in that led to an unfortunate consequence. So you might not have had the knowledge of that. You might not have done anything wrong. That doesn't mean you can't feel a sense of guilt. That's quite different to being guilty of breaking the law.
So the guilt, if there's guilt, it means there's a sense of culpability.
You feel responsible, even though you know it's not your...
Wasn't my fault.
It was an accident.
It was an accident.
You still feel that your actions have
It's on my shoulders.
Yeah.
In a situation like that, she wouldn't have been the only one that would feel guilty. Parents would have been letting the kid out of their sight.
Yes, true.
Rationally, you know, it's an accident, but guilt's not rational.
Oh.
Well, but if we're thinking about her situation, should she be punished? No.
Should probably punish herself.
Let's assume she's punished herself. No. Yeah, we started 5 past. There's a seat over in that corner. Sorry. This is a situation where the ancient Greeks probably would have seen as some sort of pollution or some sort of, a bit like the searches, there's been some sort of violation of order occurring with the death of a 3-year-old boy. And everything is, as in Hamlet, out of joint or out of order until there's some sort of restoration, however that might happen. In this case, it's not going to happen by her being charged by the police and going to jail for a year, because that would be inappropriate. So now if there has been a violation, there's been a violation of some sort of law. Maybe a sort of higher law than just the explicit thou shalt not kill.
That no man is an island.
Well, she certainly learnt that no man is an island, yes.
And the other one is maybe society teaches us a rule that if you do the right thing, good things happen. And so the rule is she did adhere to the laws, but the rule got broken because an unfortunate consequence happened, or a devastating.
Yeah, when Socrates says the good person is happy, I mean, she's an example of a good person who's actually not at all happy because of these circumstances. How can order be restored in this? I mean, maybe she becomes friends with the parents, maybe she doesn't. What? She's been awakened to a law. If we go back to this is initiation. It's in our world where it's not planned, it's not at the hands of adults. Suddenly, carefree life, let's say cheerful adolescence, not caring the world, dreaming vague dreams about the future, careers, boyfriends, whatever, suddenly shattered, and something really serious has sort of cut her life in two. There's a sort of death in order. And the question then is, through what means will I be reborn? I mean, that's not, she didn't use that language, no one would, but in our terms here today, through what means may I be reborn? Any ideas? Or does time heal? I mean, just 6 months passes, a year passes, and it's just a bad memory. Life goes on.
She'd either have to come to terms with it and sort of accept that it's happened and move on, or maybe she might do something to sort of seek a moral sort of restitution. So she might feel that maybe, I don't know, go out and do work with children.
Become a kindergarten teacher.
Yeah, or setting up a charity to,
Yep,
you know,
yep.
because you do see people that have suffered a tragedy like that, and then they'll go out and they'll campaign and they'll set up charities and
As a form of reparation, a form of repairing, even though in her case she's not culpable. I mean, the head of British Bomber Command during the Second World War, he was acting under instructions of the country trying to beat Hitler. A lot of people died because of him. He spent the rest of his life setting up charities. Exactly that.
Sometimes even with that, you know, whatever you do in response to it, you still have to live with it, and it might not be something that is as present and prevalent as it is at the start, but people who are in that situation often still have guilt many years later, and so is that like part of constructing the diagnosis? Like that's the darkness of our life. There are things that happen.
Yeah, nightmares and I mean, she might not handle it very well, take to drink or drugs, or actually wreck, and actually not go through some sort of rebirth, sort of ruin life. But this is, I think, an example from our own world in which we could use the phrase awakening to the law. Not in the way you intended or as the last thing you would possibly want, but she's learned that life is serious, that sometimes what you do really matters, even if it's the last thing you would have wanted to do, and that she's sort of implicated in some sort of violation of the law as the main actor. She was driving the car. But it's an interesting case, and if someone guilt without culpability.
My life, I feel guilty about all sorts of things that
That's
no
probably
rational reason.
irrational and neurotic guilt, whereas
Totally.
her guilt.
Guilty.
There's plenty in the world where we all suffer from masochisms and all sorts of other.
My friends tell me I should have been born Catholic because I've got a Catholic guilt complex.
We can always join the church. I'm sure the Pope will have you. And Hamlet is sort of the death of his father, and he's awakened to the law. And he's sort of crippled by it. He can't move. He's paralysed by it. In the first story, The Searchers, Ethan is awakened to the law by the murder of his family and the raping of the women. It charges him into action, and he does manage to restore order. We've had a number of stories already of different responses to awakening to the law.
Do you say it's like a way of awakening to the reality or the harsh reality that life's not fair? That things, you know...
Well, maybe that's one of the morals you could draw from this case. But hers is actually more specific. In some odd way, I have been chosen, it's completely unfair, to be the agent for something terrible, the killing of a 3-year-old boy. Fate is, I mean, it's straight out of classical Greek tragedy. Fate has somehow chosen me, poor me, why me, to be the agent for this. It was the last thing I would have wanted to do. I would do anything to undo it. But that's it. And now, you've got faced with how do I live with this? What do I do? How do I respond? That's initiation. Or it's sort of, maybe it's sort of, it's initiation outside of a carefully controlled ritual such as Aboriginal initiation was. Let's switch to the example of the Madhujara. I'm including this as a model or an example of initiation just because it's self-contained and a very strong example from a very different world from our own. But it provides a sort of model of what initiation means. You find initiation in all societies. And we don't carry out this sort of initiation. Comes a bit later why we don't. I mean, Aboriginal, let me just a little bit of background on Aboriginal culture, which is sociology of culture. And this is today's, probably the one day we're looking outside Western culture. Two examples. The Australian tribal Aboriginal culture before the arrival of Europeans was just religious, in capital R, religious. It was bathed in this, sociological language, bathed in the sacred. Everything, virtually everything was understood and interpreted as being governed by religious forces from beyond, spirits. The key stories, dreaming stories, they're known as, are all about spirit forces, supernatural forces, supernatural powers. The central thing in life is actually very simple. Keep a good relation with the supernatural powers. Full stop. This is a religious culture. The only important thing, keep good relations with the supernatural forces. Otherwise you're in big trouble. You'll die. There'll be sorcery. There'll be, you just won't survive. So the sort of world is bathed in a sense of the sacred and in particular form of supernatural forces. Very, very different world to the one we know. I mean, analogy would be back in more religious times in our own past. Sort of the important thing is keeping a good relationship with God. The only thing that matters. Salvation, relationship to God. And it's typical religious view of the world. The central ritual in this very religious, and Australian tribes or clans, their culture was pretty similar across the continent. I mean, there are differences of detail, but basic sort of cultural form over current estimates 40,000 years. Because we don't know, there's no written records, no written culture. We don't know from earlier times. The assumption is we're pretty much unchanged in the major forms, not in details, until 200 years ago, the arrival of Europeans. The central ritual, the most important ritual in this culture, if we're reading a culture, we need to know this. We started 5 past. Yeah, well, it's disrupted coming late. Example of no shame. Initiation central ritual in this culture. There's nothing at birth, equivalent, certainly no equivalent to our sort of birth rituals. No marriage rituals. There are the only other significant, as you would have picked up in your reading, the other significant ritual is death. Celebration, death. All right, the initiations are only boys, not girls. We'll talk a little bit later about maybe what speculate on why. Well, you've read probably the most striking thing to any of us is how horrendous the sort of physical, basically the sort of 6 months of systematic physical torture enacted on boys at the age of puberty, 10, 11, 12. They're sort of yanked out of childhood very easy childhood, and the men enact this physical, it's primarily an assault on the body. There's some variation from clan or tribe to in some other clans, thumbnails are ripped out. The men chew down through the scalp till the boy's face is covered in blood. Nose piercing, common, lesser component. Circumcision with stone, you've got to think with Stone Age, stone tools. And probably most extreme in the case you've read, the Mattajara, sub-incision, cutting the penis right down to the urethral canal with stone. Even women in here are squirming. Extremely painful, I can imagine, or we can imagine. And not just one event, sort of sequence of these very deliberate sort of physical assaults on the body, combined with the sort of language, you are nobody, you are nothing. The poor 10 to 12-year-old boy is treated as dead, covered in ash, told you are nobody, you are nothing, and it's like his child self is being killed off, and in a most painful way. And probably, not as bad as you imagine, in that they'd be sort of made aware of what was coming. So it is a shock, no doubt it was a shock when it happened, but there's also a positive anticipation. This is the process I go through in order to become a man. Initiation, rite of passage, in the anthropological term, R-I-T-E, from transformation from one stage of life to another stage of life, from childhood to adulthood. And that's what's going on in these initiations. So the boys are treated as a nobody, as a nothing. The child self really is systematically trodden on, annihilated. And then the new culture, the adult Aboriginal culture, is slowly introduced through teaching the secret language of the religious knowledge, words of songs, painting, stories. So the awakening to the law is the law of the culture, and it is the sort of second phase of the initiation. So the first phase, killing off, the death phase of the child self, and then there's the rebirth at the hands of the adult males, the elders, being taught the secret knowledge, introduced to sacred objects, chiringas. And it seems to have worked from all the anthropological accounts brilliantly well. The boys would then basically spend the rest of their lives with their primary pleasure carrying out religious duties, religious rituals. Any idea why it's so extreme?
Yeah, I sort of see it as a way it's a mental and physical conditioning process. So as a child, the child himself has to be killed off in a sense to be taught that the realities of the world and the environment you're living is hostile, and you've got to be prepared for it, ready for it. Because once you're a man, you'll be expected to be a provider, a hunter-gatherer, killer for everyone else.
Mm-hmm. So it's a bit like going into the army and going through same Western army initiations.
It reminds me of Full Metal Jacket.
Full Metal Jacket.
You see that where they...
You see some parallels, yeah. Why does everybody, they don't there was a fair bit of violence in the Aboriginal world against other tribes and men against women, but you know, it was hardly like going into the army. Any Freudian readers? Anyone else want to please? I mean, there's a very specific situation in which is very, very different from our old world, and that is the first 10 years, so to speak, are a very, very indulgent childhood. Almost a utopian ideal childhood for both boys and girls. That it's a sort of time of almost complete indulgence compared to the world we know. No matter if you go through the basics of the childhood experience, no forced weaning. Aboriginal children could suck at their mother's breasts basically as long as they liked. And there was no attempt to wean them, forced weaning. If another child came along and an older child had been weaned, would often go back and food comfort onto the mother's breast. No toilet training, no forced, you must go to the toilet or every 4 hours or, whatever rituals we impose on basically very easygoing. Aboriginal children used to, in the Madu case, toilet train just by copying other children. But other examples of the really very negligible punishment. I mean, basically children were allowed to do pretty much what they wanted. No restraints on masturbation. Actually, often parents or elders would play with their children and joke about them. It's hard to think of any interdicts. There was a very mild "thou shalt not" on seeing parents engaged in sex. Of course, there was no sex between sons and boys and their mothers. That was a restraint on that. And we'll keep in mind.
It's just that they become the centre of attention in the family and in the band, so they're not like peripheral.
And they're surrounded by an extended family, and above all, women, very sort of sociable, cosy world without threat, without much threat or anxiety or constraint, basically. Very, very indulgent. It probably as an indulgent childhood as you can imagine in any human society. I'm using indulgent, I'm not using it in any pejorative sense, and it was an ideal childhood. It's probably the reason that if we look at anthropological studies, some of them have been Freudian, of the general feeling that Australian Aborigines are very unneurotic. Didn't suffer from neurosis, depression, sexual perversions, very generous, happy, generous, usually not eating martajara or living in the desert, really not worried about storing food, not anxious about tomorrow. The stories of so casual that boomerangs tossed away and couldn't be bothered carrying them, rather than worrying about, what am I going to do tomorrow about my boomerang. The sort of happy, cheerful, easygoing, unneurotic adults. And the Freudian reading of that's probably pretty persuasive, that you can relate this back to such an indulgent childhood. Very uninhibited in sexual relations, not too fussed about liaisons, people having sexual relations outside their marriage, and practice polygamy, numbers of wives and husbands. Pretty generous. Husband or wife dies, the survivor, whatever age, would remarry. Promiscuity was frowned upon, mildly frowned upon, but apart from that, as long as you're fairly discreet, not too... there'd be aspects of this that wouldn't appeal to many of you, like husbands would often give their wives sexual favours to guests or people they thought they owed debts. It was a very patriarchal society. If you start to get sort of dewy-eyed about Australian Aboriginal society, extremely patriarchal. I mean, classic courting ritual amongst the Aranda was at marriage. The husband would whack his wife over the head with a stick, knock her into semi-unconsciousness just to teach her who was boss, and drag her off by the hair. And there are lots of accounts from early white settlement of violence towards women, breaking arms, legs, even killing your rape husbands. So, it's not, don't get too utopian or dewy-eyed about this world. But very, very indulgent childhood, leading to pretty much guilt, anxiety, guilt, very low guilt, anxiety, need to hoard, adulthood. This presents a problem with the boys. One reason for such an extreme initiation. Anyone want to hazard? The extremity of the childhood indulgence actually requires, with the boys especially, extreme initiation because of male propensity for violence. All cultures spend a fair bit of their energy controlling the aggression of young men between the ages of about 15 and 30, virtually the cause of almost all violent crime. Every culture has to get the potential violence of its males under control. And the Australian Aboriginal, this is one reason, it's not the only reason for initiation, it's not the only function, for looking at the function of initiation, not the only function, but it's the most obvious one in sociological terms. Basically, the men teach the boys when they're hitting puberty, testosterone's going to start to flow, adrenaline, where they're about to enter the stage at which delightful little boys can turn into delinquent teenagers. That you have no power. We will show you what power means. We will humiliate you. We will torture you. We will subject your bodies to systematic cruelty in order that you don't, you know that you have to keep your place.
In one of the descriptions of the ritual, they talked about dependent on the boy's previous behaviour, that would have a direct correlation with the extremity of of the abuse that they received.
So then the more...
So they've been sort of outrageous before that.
The more anarchic, the more severe the initiation.
Yeah.
There's a form of what in Freudian tradition called sublimation, of taking potentially anarchic and destructive aggressive impulses and channeling them into culturally creative activity. Aboriginal world, that's a religious activity. Sublimation. There's no need to use this terminology, but taking potentially aggressive, violent, destructive feelings and channeling them, socialising them, use that term, into the group. Football teams and clubs do a bit of that now in our world, taking violent and extremely useful therapeutically and for the social well-being to get teenage boys racing around very active, potentially violent activities and not killing each other.
So, from a sociological perspective, is that part of the reason that the childhood is so indulgent, that you need that to make the
Hard to know.
Initiation?
Hard to know who planned.
Yeah.
We don't know who planned what. But once you've got an indulgent childhood, you're going to have to do something extreme with the boys.
Yeah.
And
but that almost works in favour, doesn't it? That it makes it more extreme. If they had a tightly regulated childhood the initiation might not be quite as extreme.
Well, exactly like our world, we don't need those sort of initiations, largely because childhood is a whole series of progressions of discipline, control, thou shalt not, going to school, going to kindergarten, going to school, having order imposed on you, stage by stage by stage.
Death of 1,000 cuts.
Death by 1,000 cuts, if you like, yeah. If the best life is the life of the child, this is quite a common assumption that happiness is the 5-year-old child or whatever, and if only we could all live as 5-year-old children forever. But if, I suppose part of all of us is tempted in that direction. It's death by, our growing up is death by 1,000 cuts. And clearly one reason that there's no social need for female initiation is that's not a social problem. Female aggression is not a social problem. There are other societies where there is female initiation, by the way, so that's not universal. In Papua New Guinea and Melanesia's female initiations. We can come back to this, but of course in the modern world with the breakdown of Aboriginal culture, the not carrying out of initiations has been an increasing problem with male violence, getting drunk, bashing wives, sort of exactly in the sociological position what you'd expect once the culture is no longer doing what it needed to do.
Some would argue you can even see that in Western culture. There's the argument that these days a lot of children are indulged or overindulged and not disciplined, and leading to problems as they get older.
At the end of this discussion of Aboriginals, I think we'll turn to our own world and ask about equivalence to initiation. Now, other functions of this, but certainly the problem of male aggression is not the only one. We've got machines. Do you need a fan on? Other functions of reading this carefully, thinking, what in the hell, why would these people be so extreme with their voice?
Well, it's an extreme environment, so they have to be.
It's extreme environment, yes, but there were, Victoria or there are other parts where Aborigines lived that weren't so extreme, and they were so initiated. Also, they're not really worried about hoarding or saving food or...
To create that demarcation between childhood and adulthood, so sort of like, you cross a line and suddenly it's a whole new set of behaviours that are expected.
Yeah. Is that getting a bit noisy? That's okay. Better with it on? Well, the second main reason is to do with basically the boys spend most of their time in their early years with women. Separation from the mother. Hamlet could have done with this. It's men who tear the boy away from women and especially mother. Into the world of men. So the indulgence of the early years is partly associated with the women, although male kin are indulgent too. It happens to be a minor way in our world when you first go to school. You sort of in the 19th century, the English private schools would actually quite deliberately take boys and put them in boarding schools at age 7 or 8, actually a bit younger than this. Tell me if it's too noisy. Or it's getting irritating. I seem to only have one speed. To tear the boys away from their mothers, sort of traumatic separation, creates in the literature what's often known as separation anxiety, and in a way kill off the early childhood or childhood. The Spartans did it, yes. It's not uncommon that there's a certain point at which boys particularly are ripped away from the sort of consoling, loving, compassionate world of the mother and of women. There's a Freudian anthropologist, Bruno Bettelheim, wrote a book on initiation called Symbolic Wounds. He went further with this. He argued that all males, it's universal, suffered from envy of women and their capacity to create. And that male initiations are a sort of an attempt to make men creative, culturally creative, in compensation for the fact they don't give birth. And then Bettelheim argues that's basically the major reason for initiations like the ones you've been reading about. Now, there's plenty of symbolic stuff in this chapter which is supportive of, the need to rip the boys away from the world of women and sort of build a male culture. Bettelheim's probably too extreme, but there's no doubt there's something of this going on. I mean, the fact that they're eating their own foreskins and the sort of need to gain some sort of power, sexual power, creative power.
They didn't know that sperm created
No,
babies.
no,
Yeah.
no births. Your parents are not your actual biological parents. You said your father's not your biological father. No, it's all read religiously in terms of animal tokens.
Yeah, they believed in the spirit. You had a spirit father. And, yeah.
So has science given men their identity?
As Western science given men their identity because of sperm.
Or how it's given that?
Maybe. More of a role. Any thoughts on this?
I was thinking they might want to teach them fear, just about fear.
Teach them fear? Yeah, I think that's definitely there. This is teaching fear.
Yeah, but also so that you can defend yourself. Without fear, you might just sort of. I'm thinking now also of the army, they're training them to do.
Yeah.
And teach them to be able to cope with the fear and the pain and.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. This is a sort of separate function. So teaching of fear and to be aware and to deal with threat, which it's a very indulgent child who would leave feeling, wouldn't we, that I'm never in any danger.
No wonder they cried a lot.
They
People
cried.
witnessing it. I think it's very sad.
sad.
That was really interesting, actually, wasn't it? The role of the activist and the role of the mourner. So with every ritual, both of those sides were represented. As a person receiving the ritual, there was an acknowledgement that both of those experiences are valid.
Yeah.
That there's pain in this and empowerment.
And there's the mourning for the loss of childhood.
Yeah.
There is the death. The death theme is very strong in the ritual.
It seems to be like a culture of like inclusion as well. It's through going through the process,
Yep.
being taught the customs and traditions along the way. Boys start to learn it's like a sense of hierarchy, but they also start to earn their place inside their own community
Yeah,
by abiding to these customs and traditions.
that's
So
very
it's
true.
an
So it's almost
inclusive
another
process.
function again, sort of belonging, joining the community. As an adult, as a serious adult person. Yeah, so there's this sort of social community binding, socially binding function going on. It's the machine, so we want them back on. It's the machine outside that's making the noise, isn't it? Not the fans. Yeah, okay, good. So we've got that too. Sort of way of bringing, in a shared experience, everyone goes through it. It's much less individualistic society than the one. I mean, our world is at the extreme of human societies in terms of individualistic. So the bonding is to the community, but also, but above all, to the religious law of the community. Any other function you can think of these initiations?
Like teaching them, especially teenagers, they're not the centre of the universe.
Yeah. Teaching teenagers you're not the centre
And
of
it
the
deals
universe.
with the ego.
Yeah, you're destroying ego. It's an assault on the ego.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You're nobody. You're nothing. And then there's a new meaning, which is not me, the ego that is indulged, but the new meaning is providing a quite different function, providing the new meaning of the religious beliefs, of understanding the world in which I inhabit and how it works, and my role in that. This is education in the full sense. Very serious education.
What about your body's not your own, in a way?
Your body's not your own.
It must have really mucked up their whole sense of control over
Their body.
their
And maybe even your body's not that important. It's the spirit that matters. Again, back to the nature of the religious culture. And we never understand a society. One aspect of understanding any society is looking at its moral rules, its laws. And Aboriginal world had two areas of very serious moral law. One was religious, very strong thou shalt nots associated with religion. And the other one was kinship, very strict rules over who you could marry, or even who you could associate with. Apart from that, very, very weak thou shalt nots. When the religious really is keeping in tune with the good spirits in order to not to be attacked by bad spirits. It's a very strong belief in evil forces, sorcery. Kinship, very, very, it's probably the one area of Aboriginal culture which is extraordinarily complicated. A number of anthropologists have said no Westerner ever really understands Aboriginal kinship classification. You got something to say? And basically it's an incest. Something like 80% of women are prohibited from a given male because of incest rules that you cannot have sexual relations with. Very, very strict.
Possibly because they form small bands of people.
Maybe. The reason may be because they're small bands.
They say that recently there's been very high incidence in some remote communities of incest and child abuse. How would you, given that it goes against these kinship sort of things, how would you explain such a turnaround?
Well, the culture, and it's a bit like the searches, the culture has largely collapsed. You know, whatever pious things Europeans or we say about Aboriginal, it's large. Once you stop doing the central things in the culture, like initiation, then morality will. You will get anarchy, morality, and it's tragic. Very sad and tragic, but it's an inevitable. The searches was an analysis of this, of what happens when culture breaks down or weakens.
What John was saying before about the culture being so happy and easygoing and worry-free, I mean, mental health statistics today will represent something very different, which just reinforces what you're saying as well.
And which is probably also linked to diet and alcohol and some indirect pathologies. All right, so two very important areas of thou shalt not. We're doing a sociological analysis of this culture, generalising about it. There are a few other areas of be generous, moral laws, be hospitable, sort of weak things on theft, against promiscuity, not particularly extreme. What else?
Sharing food?
Sharing food, yes. Moral support for sharing food, sharing possessions, which often makes it difficult for Aborigines today. Income, because all their relatives come and part of their own culture requires them to share everything they have. Excuse me. If we have moral laws, we're looking at moral laws, you need to understand sanctions. What are the punishments for breaking moral law? We know our own. But in the Aboriginal world, there are probably four main areas of sanctions or punishments for breaking this moral code. The most powerful was fear of evil spirits. That if I commit sacrilege, if I do something that's against the religious rules, or actually commit incest, I will lose the protection of good spirits, and the bad spirits will get me. I'll be vulnerable. The sort of fear of religious punishment. This is linked to a second inhibition or fear, and that's literally sorcery. Of people you've injured, mobilising evil spirits against you. I suppose the most famous example of that is bone pointing. The bone's pointed. There are documented cases of Aborigines whom the bone is pointed against just dying in 3 days. So if that's true, that shows the power of the fear of sorcery. That you actually believe that evil spirit is going to get you, you can just wither and die. So the main sanctions are religious. Again, it's a world that's pretty foreign to us. Maybe there's some belief in our world that justice will be done. If I do something I shouldn't do, then there'll be some form of punishment or fate or something like that. That's a very loose, diffuse equivalent to fear of evil spirits or fear of loss of contact with the good spirits, my spirits, the powerful spirits. Third form of punishment or sanction is literally physical. Wounding, spearing, stonings, beatings. Tomkinson's got an example of a girl who has an incestuous liaison and her female kin. There's a chair down the back. Her female kin draw her apart and start beating her with sticks and bashing her with stones and calling her a whore, and she's bringing the family into disrepute. She's mad with actual physical punishments. At the hands of other women, in this case, it's a woman who's young woman who's transgressing the incest taboo, treated very, very seriously, stoned, beaten. And in combination, fourth form of punishment, shaming. There's still some significance in our world, but much more significant in strong community societies. And the women called her a whore, she was mad. The older women urinated on her, just to show how defiled, how dirty. Just humiliation tactic, which in the end worked. She stopped the incestuous liaison.
When we talk about incest, we're really talking about within the complex.
Within their kinship roles, yeah.
Not just a mother-son
No,
or a
no.
brother-sister.
In terms of their kinship rules. Yes, relations wouldn't affect us at all.
Yeah.
So that's sort of an overview of the world in which these male initiations take part. Girls learn what they need to learn to become adult women largely by imitation, spending their time with women, learning food gathering and learning how to bring up children, which will be their two major roles in adulthood: food gathering, digging yams and whatever else, and child raising. For education purposes, there didn't seem any need. There wasn't a need to initiate women. Any questions about all of that? We start talking about our own world.
With the women not needing initiation, in some ways the objectification of the women in things like marriage would be physically aggressive enough to have similar outcomes as the initiation.
The fear and constraint. Yeah. Male, just direct male aggression in relation to wife's behaviour played that role. Yes.
And the male aggression they learn from the initiation that they, during that initiation where all the males get it and they have circumcision and, like how you were saying about using lots of force and blood and, a lot of pain, physical pain that the male has experienced, and they sort of learn that and sort of the learned, they sort of bring it to how they
treat women.
Not treat women, but control the family. That's how they sort of understand the world, or how to understand what fear is and how to react with taboos and stop taboos and things like that.
Well, that maybe that's true, but with marriage and beating wives into submission. They only got to watch what other men do. You know, it's not very complicated. And if you're stronger and it comes down to biceps, men are stronger. It's a brutal and simple fact. It probably doesn't need very complicated. There isn't a taboo on treating your new wife that way is significant. There isn't a constraint on that. One thing we didn't discuss in looking at initiations themselves, this does relate to the distancing from women and the power stuff, is the focus on the sort of symbolic castration, sort of the assault on the penis, is basically, Freud very strong on this. This is symbolically castration, basically saying you had no power. We can castrate you if we want, make you completely powerless. But then it's also the sort of focus of creativity or generativity, even though fatherhood's not acknowledged in this way. But it's sort of striking that the physical assault is predominant, not entirely, it's predominantly on circumcision and subincision. On male fertility. This, I think, does sort of invoke a sense of, well, something's going on here about the sense of males being creative or not creative, or how do you produce adult men who are creative, generative. Well, as I've said, this all seems to have been brilliantly successful, and it created men who were very happy then to devote much of the rest of their lives to religious activity, to communal religious activity, keeping the culture strong. This is all about education, learning the culture, what the culture is. Culture is primarily religious, and then creating a desire, a passion for, in the rest of life, enacting initiations, religious rituals, as the most important part of life. Through awakening to the law. So the law here is more than just the moral law, it's the beliefs of the society. It's sort of almost a higher law.
But there's no supreme being, apparently.
No, there are spirits. There isn't a God in that sense, no. There are a range of spirits. Yeah, there's not a monotheism at all. And it's not really like the classical Greek gods and goddesses.
They're not moral spirits. They're not telling them what they must do.
Well, except the spirits react to bad behaviour. So in fact they sort of are. They're much more moral than Greek gods and goddesses. They will punish breaking laws. So they are sort of moral. What about our world, initiation in our world? Do we have initiations of any form? We mentioned the army, but what about rites of passage?
Learning to drive.
Learning to drive, and gaining your driver's licence aged 18 is a sort of rite of passage, isn't it? Acknowledged as an adult. It's hardly a character transforming experience, though. What else?
Things that aren't like formalised, but I guess, your first sexual experience, your, drinking, getting drunk for the first time, things like that. Perhaps.
Well, getting drunk is a sort of symbolic death, isn't it?
Especially the first time.
Especially the first time.
What about a deb?
Yes, debutantes. And how does that work?
I don't know.
Come on, you can do that.
Coming into society or something.
Before you're, it's not as big as before you're a girl and after you're a woman or anything like that, is it? But it is a ritual rite of passage.
University graduation.
University graduation for some, leaving school for others,
Leaving home to go to university.
leaving home. Leaving home is a sort of, it's a separation from home, mother, father, brothers, sisters. What about travelling overseas?
Having a child.
For women. Maybe another reason that female initiation is less important when women experience enough physical pain equivalent to Aboriginal initiations. Childbirth is probably no less for many women in terms of ordeal. Maybe a factor here. That hasn't changed. I suppose we've got drugs everywhere, it has changed.
Certain religious ceremonies in some religions, so bar mitzvahs for Jewish and maybe First Communion for
Catholics or Anglicans. Yeah, but certainly remain religious rites of passage. Baptism, still. How many in this room have been baptised? Sort of. Even towards the heart. Infant, was it always infant? No.
I don't think I've been, apart from weddings and funerals, I don't think I've been to church since my baptism.
When you were, 3 days old? Or?
No, I was maybe 5 or 6 months.
5 or 6 months.
I haven't, apart from like school, church and stuff like that.
So we'd have to say your rite of passage didn't work.
No, and it's not for, you're going out against my parents. We just didn't go to church. It was just something that we did, and then open church.
So it was a sort of half-deed ritual when you did it. Yeah, we've got the sort of the ghosts of rituals, don't we? The debutante's probably a bit like that, sort of half alive, half dead.
But it's more, I did mine with the year level of the girls below, so it was not like, I was hanging with people, friends I'd made, the last 4 or 5 years at high school. It was more, for them, and it was really interesting to see how it was more, not about like giving the girls away, but just the girl spending all day prettying themselves up and getting ready for it, and then the actual ritual.
So it was an excuse for a party. It was fun.
It's just fun.
Just fun.
Yeah.
So there's no transformation going on.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, no. Well, where are transformations? Apart from an individual experience like the 18-year-old that I mentioned, that's a transformation. When are you first going to school? Because the first time you're leaving the world in which you're loved, you're entering a world in which you're not loved. Which in these days, we're in childcare, kindergarten. I mean, that's an equivalent to that separation from the world of mothers and women. Yes?
Yeah, definitely. I have memories of my first day at school, age 4.
It's traumatic?
Yeah.
Yeah. First day at school is quite often traumatic. And it's probably for this reason that, it's a sudden shock that actually the world doesn't love me in the way that the home did or does.
It's almost a rite of passage for the mother as well. When my son first started school, there was this sort of this collective of women hanging around outside the school
anxiously.
gate. Yeah. And the next year they started having champagne breakfast. Yeah.
What, to drown their anxiety?
Yeah, I think so. Become relaxed from it.
Well, you can imagine the Aboriginal mothers would be suffering similar things, knowing what their poor, darling 10-year-old son's going through.
And I wonder whether they would be able to take the role of the mourner within the ceremony. In that, because it made reference to the negotiations of who would participate on both sides.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, it is not just the death of childhood, it's the death of the relation of mothering the son. It's a sort of death of the relationship of mother to son that's going on here. So it's actually quite serious.
And in their situation, perhaps several mothers. It seems that most children identify with at least two women.
In previous generations, getting married would have been a rite of passage because often people were a lot younger, you know, they were 18 or 19 when they'd get married. So they'd go straight from their family home to their married home.
Husbands or wife.
I thought of that before as we were saying that lots of the things have just become fun. So we still have bucks nights and hens nights and that sort of thing, but maybe the focus has changed now to it's just a fun experience to have before you
Is that
get
true?
married.
Of the grotesqueries of bucks nights and hens nights? Is it fun or?
What I've heard, a lot of bucks nights have changed from the 10 years ago of strip clubs to more mates hanging out, camping trips, paintball, go-karting. Instead of just going out and making fun of the soon-to-be groom, they're more that the mates just hang out and do some fun stuff.
Right, it used to be humiliating the groom, didn't it?
Now it's like
Getting
a
him
male,
drunk and symbolic death and humiliation.
now it's like a male bonding thing. They'll go away for the weekend and
So are people searching for meaning a bit more?
The male bonding is sort of, in a way, the signal of that is you're leaving, the nice cosy world of your mates and you're going off. Have you thought about what you're going to lose?
Yeah.
You're going off to spend with one person and it's a she, not a he. So that's probably is an element still there of separation going on with the male bonding. And I think it's still true, isn't it? At speeches at weddings, the best man will often make rhapsodic references to their lives before marriage. What a great time we had, and how you're surrendering yourself to the apron strings, and all these other curses are now about to come on you, which is not entirely. I suspect that's not entirely in fun. There's some sort of rite of passage going on there that you really know what you've done or what you're doing. The female equivalent to that doesn't really happen at hens nights, does it? Or is there humiliation going on there too?
We're just a bit more gentle about it.
The humiliation goes all throughout life.
The curse of being born.
The speeches at 21st and that sort of thing, we still hold on a little bit to a before and after at 21st in our culture.
And there's a sense of sudden loss of what's gone, like death. There's a sort of childhood has sort of died, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. Well, 21st are also a sort of lukewarm rite of passage, aren't they?
Well, I've been coupled this year, and one of my friends, she was making a speech, and she said, I don't know what's so special about 21, I've been able to drive for a couple of years, I've been able to drink, I've been able to work, it's like, if you sort of poke fun of it, it's a big event that really means nothing now. It's not like it was, World War One era when that was when it actually became legal to drink, and it was legal aid for consent for voting and everything. It was now just a lot of bygone era kind of thing.
Yeah, there's no transition.
To be fair, in the US, 21 is still a big deal.
It's not a big deal. What happens there?
You reach drinking age.
Okay, so 18 is not drinking age.
No.
We have a tradition where if you're a man and you're not married before you're 25, they will tie you up and will sing on you.
Okay.
And when you turn 30, it's good.
So is that at a party or at some?
No, it's just a tradition. In some parts of Denmark, if you turn 25 and you're not married,
You get
cinnamon
tough.
and then pepper.
yeah.
And who does this? Is it elders or your friends do it?
And a lot of times people would be prepared, like they would wear old clothing because they know they're going to be tied up.
That's interesting. So 25 to 30 is a sort of punishment by your peers for not being married.
That would work here.
What would
Today's
happen?
people are waiting a lot longer to get married.
Well, maybe it doesn't. Does it work in Denmark? People get married younger?
No.
No, so it doesn't work either. Well, we had school, living, then going overseas the first time into a world that's alien. I mean, it's another separation from home in a way, isn't it, for a lot of people? Yes or no? Travelling? Yes.
I think it was like my first road trip with my mates. You know, it wasn't, you know, we drove out to like Glenrowan, which for us like a 3-hour drive, which was, you know, it's different to not, because at that stage, you know, I'd have been holidays with my family, or, you know, and that was the first time, you know, we'd gone away, and now, you know, you don't have people had your license, you know, 6-8 months, and it's, you know, an experience to drive, you know.
Was there anything negative or a sense of loss or in that?
My only distracted me for a super long time, so it was more just the experience of, you know, hanging out, sort of learning how to fend for ourselves, you know, cooking our own food and stuff. We had, even if it was only for a couple of days, it was, you know, not being at home, having comfort of home, living in a cabin.
Sounds like an adventure. I think for initiation you need a sense of loss and death and mourning, that something has really been lost that you're never going to get back.
Finishing high school. It's a bit like that. Not that I really want to admit that I was sad to finish high school, but...
So we mean a comfortable, ordered world of,
yeah.
you know...
And being with friends and being in that known environment, and then suddenly it's the big unknown.
Yeah.
And knowing that you're not going to see a lot of these people anymore, and that everything's changing, and, you know...
There's a sense of expectation maybe from your parents and your family that you're going to start taking on more responsibilities for looking after yourself at that time.
So there's sort of anxiety, what am I going to do with my life, and what have I been given to help me?
My mum's friend panicked when she turned 30.
She panicked when she turned 30 because...
She thought she was old. And she was like no longer. She had to like settle down and like become officially an adult and go and party. And
turning 30 was the sort of death that, you know, life is up till 30 and 30 is death. Is fear of death, or fear of that my life's over, or fear that everything's going wrong, that could be a sort of failed initiation. Like Hamlet sort of can't respond. The fear that I'm not going to respond, or fear of failure, fear that...
First death or first funeral can be a initiation too. Like I can remember I was 16 or 17, so quite old when a friend's mother passed away. It was the first time I knew someone that I personally knew had died, and it was a real, sort of you faced your own mortality.
Yeah, so it's a serious moment.
Yeah.
Has anyone else got the death, first encounter with death? Human death? Anyone else? Because that's probably quite common.
Yeah. I was about 10 when my uncle died. I didn't really understand what was happening.
How old were you?
About 9 or 10.
9 or 10, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have that experience. My parents took the view that like all the kids in our family go to all the funerals, where some parents go, no, it's too traumatising for them, or they don't understand.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember being at funerals when I was like very small, like 4 or 5, going, Mum, what's in the box? But I'd been to funerals from a really long age, so by the time I was 9 or 10, it wasn't really shocking.
You were used to it.
Yeah, I was. I've been to like 18 funerals or something.
But then, even in that, I think sometimes if it's someone close and young, so unexpected. In my son's family, so on his father's side, a couple of years ago, they're a really large family, 9 siblings. One of the siblings died in a car accident, and quite young, by low 20s. And watching the family, the way that they reacted, that wasn't an initiation, definitely. There was a real death, but there was a lot of death in identity, and they reformed as a family unit, and they're really different today in the way they relate to each other to the way they were before that happened.
So they were awakened to something.
Yeah.
Whether you call it a law is another question.
And so they'd experienced death on lots of levels, but that was just something that, impinged on them.
The death of someone close or a parent can be very powerful.
Well, I'm curious, like to a lesser extent, like not the death of a parent, but like Dad left Mum 2 years ago, and it's changed how the family operates. We moved out of the family home that I'd lived in my entire life, and it's just it just changed how you operate as a family unit on like my mum's side of the family.
So sort of a sense of there's a past that's now gone.
Yeah.
Can it do the opposite? Can it go from like good to bad after a death? Or not really?
Yes, of course. You go from. What do you mean? What's an example?
Like when my pa died on my dad's side, like he was the one that kept the whole family together. And so then when he goes, it's like now my family's been fighting for like 15 years. So it's like it goes from something really good and we're all happy families and then.
So
that was a sort of
sense of rebirth.
Yeah, that's a sense of practical things, though, isn't it? The person who really kept the harmony in the family was gone, rather than you suddenly, my goodness, we die, and the sort of shock of death and your own sense of mortality. It's probably a bit different, that example. Unless there's a sense too that I suppose the good order is gone. I suppose that does fit.
Yeah, well, my experience is similar to her in the sense that it wasn't my first experience of death. That was when my kindergarten teacher passed away. That was my first experience. That was when I was 5 or 6. But when I was like 12, my best friend passed away, and that kind of affected the order of my life a little bit. So that was my first realization of death itself.
Well, what impact did it have?
Well, we used to do pretty much everything together, so all of a sudden we couldn't, I wasn't playing soccer with him, every other day or hanging out and stuff like that. So in that way, it affected me in that way. So, yeah.
Did it raise metaphysical questions of, what, who am I? What happens when what happened to the world go on when I'm dead?
Right. What happens to me, that kind of stuff. And so I found myself turning a little bit to religion, if you will, to answer those questions as well. So,
yeah, even as a 12-year-old. Do we need initiations? Do we need to get more serious again about initiations, or without going to the Aboriginal extreme?
From what I hear about the behaviour of primary school children, yes.
Yeah, poor teachers, primary and secondary, become behaviour management.
There's very big now they have like a graduation from primary school. They'll have like an actual official graduation ceremony from the end of primary school.
We've gone the other direction, haven't we? Teachers can't punish. There's no corporal punishment, straps or wax.
There's lots of arguments that culturally we need some form of initiation for children who are growing into teenagers. So around sexuality, identity, all those sorts of things.
What forms might they take?
Well, I guess there's, like I know there's lots of programs at schools that around the Year 9 level, that's when kids get taken on campus a lot. And so it is about that separation, but also about dealing with what's to come, talking about issues and also physically.
Age 14, 15. Yeah. Schools used to have dancing classes too, didn't they, where actually embarrassed, awkward teenagers learn to do things. Like the opposite sex used to learn to do things together with some sort of harmony, and they were, I think, a type. I don't know, there's still dancing classes?
My school did them.
High school?
My school did at high school. My primary school had them.
Primary school had them. Yeah, it's too early. It's teenage.
Do you hear arguments these days that say that like people aren't growing up the same? You know, you get people in their 30s and 40s and 50s are still, you know, acting like teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, people put forward the theory, I guess, that there is no rite of passage, there's no clear thing, so that...
the assumption being this wasn't the case 40 years ago,
yeah,
which might be a rash assumption.
Yeah.
I guess with that too, like it feels like a lot of life events happen a bit later. You know, people get married a bit later now, they have children a bit later now, so that's sort of all.
And your education can take you through to your mid-20s or even later, which does prolong lots of other things.
I think there's less definition as well, like, and these days I think maybe, sorry, what am I trying to say? Back when my parents grew up, you know, my mum was 21 when she got married, and that was old to be getting married for the first time sort of thing. She wasn't quite an old maid, but it was sort of getting there, whereas now, of course, it's totally different. And then also, you know, people change careers, you know, you go back to uni later in life like I have, all sorts of, you maybe didn't have the same sort of flexibility a couple of generations ago.
Yep. That changes things. What about, we haven't talked about traumatic relationship breakups, you know, romance gone wrong. It's like death, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or it's experienced like death for a day, 6 months, 6 years. Yes or no? You know, it's like an initiation. Will never happen again. Or it happens again and again and again.
It doesn't feel like it at the time, but on reflection, you realise that it was a good thing, that it has made you wiser. Definitely.
Well, that's often said, isn't it, of suffering, experience of suffering. Today I'm a better person or I'm a stronger person. I'm often suspicious when anyone says that. In fact, they need to say it. It's not very convincing. What do we think, though?
All people search for spiritual meaning, and I don't mean to be demeaning in that way, but look for an answer or a meaning or a reason for something traumatic to happen.
And the suffering. Suffering is a sort of death, and especially extreme suffering, and provokes the need to make sense of it. And if it's a failed romance, it may be 3 days later and you think, well, you know, he's just such a loathsome character, I'm better off without him. But you find some explanation for the sequence of events.
But it can certainly be a rebirth, because you're often in a situation where you have to recreate your life. And you're totally transformed.
Like you might actually have to get a new house, you might have to find a new source of income, so all those circumstances.
And your vision of the future.
Yes.
Yes.
You're following one path, you think that's where your life's going to go, then suddenly it changes, and
I mean, does suffering necessarily make people stronger and wiser?
No, not always.
No, obviously not, but it can?
it can.
It can.
Definitely.
Well, after my parents divorced, my mum became more independent. Before then, she didn't work. She had no income of herself. So afterwards, she got a job. She became a lot happier. Then
So
got
it's a sort of
remarried.
liberation.
Yeah.
Divorce. That often happens with women after divorce. I mean, sociological figures on that women are much better off than men after separation or divorce.
She did a lot better than my dad.
Yeah, well, that fits the common pattern. Well, that's the sort of end of a marriage, is a sort of death, isn't it? And can provoke depression.
Remarriage can for kids too. When the parents get remarried.
For example, before. So we've got lots of little sort of rites of passage here and there which strike in a way that's quite unpredictable. What about change of career, or you sort of go down one path, train for something, and you decide this is really not what I want to do, or I'm actually not very good at it, it's not me? Is that can be traumatic.
It's often that's almost like reshaping your identity when you come to a point like that in your life where you maybe
If you can.
Yeah, if you can do it.
Yeah.
But it's a process of almost reshaping and becoming someone else.
That's what we spoke about, like moving house, not just moving at home for the first time. Even like as a family, you know, like say, you know, you and your wife, and your kids, you're uprooting your family, moving it. Even if you're moving, you know, to the next suburb, or even to stay overseas, it's a big changing experience. Even if you're not doing it even the first time, but even successive times, it's not a small task to move.
Yeah. Suffering is probably the key here, though, if we go back to Nietzsche. What Greek tragedy does is a powerful example of suffering, and then it's a question of how the person responds. I mean, like the 18-year-old I started today with, how the person responds, whether they can take it on. The first day at school, if it's traumatic, is a day of suffering. I mean, something, maybe in some children, something dies and there's the need, and after suffering there really is a need to find an explanation, that it's actually meaningless suffering that is really hard to bear. Probably such a drive to rationalise that, you know, I'm a better person for the experience, which may be the case, may not be the case, but there's a need to believe that I'm a stronger and a better person. Or my life will be richer.
You've learned something.
I've learned something.
Or you've taught someone
sort
else
of the
something.
knowledge, optimism. I've learned something, and therefore the suffering is justified. But if we do go back to Nietzsche, it's extreme suffering which is the key to culture, and that creates culture and the points of time when you need culture. I think let's have a 20-minute break and we'll come back to essay topic, which will be suffering and Ekalavya. All right, short essay. Short essay. I'm not sure. Two texts. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, about 100-page, usually regarded as a novella or short novel. Written in English, so there's no problems with translation. Although Conrad was a Pole, English was his second language, he wouldn't know it reading his words. It's in the bookshop in a fairly cheap Penguin. There's endless ways of getting hold of it. It's a classic. It's very easy to get hold of Heart of Darkness. Probably, unless you're very well aligned to online, you're probably better having your own hard copy, but you won't have much trouble finding it online, Heart of Darkness. Some of you may have, anyone studied at school? Yeah, that's...
That was about 12 years ago.
Right, so it's a project. Just in the morning, anyone who had just forget everything you did at school. It's usually read as an anti-colonialism text. I also don't bother with secondary literature stuff on Heart of Darkness. Just read it at least a couple of times. Those of you who don't know it. How many of you know it, Heart of Darkness? There's actually quite a few. You'll know it indirectly in Apocalypse Now. There's quite explicitly Heart of Darkness in the Vietnam War. I don't think it'll help you understand the book. It's a pretty clumsy working of it. Fight Club is a much more intelligent reworking of Heart of Darkness. I know many of you know Fight Club, looking at Fight Club. Again, it's getting a bit warm in here, isn't it? Yeah. It's better if you open a couple of those windows at the back of the room. This is one of the oldest buildings in the university, and it's actually got good central heating. Not ideal. This sort of thanks. I think the catch is on. Pull it up and pull the blind, and the catch is on at the top. Okay, Heart of Darkness is very readable. It's not like Nietzsche. You won't have any trouble reading it. But working out what's going on is more difficult. Alright, so two texts, Nietzsche and Heart of Darkness. It's 1,500 words. 1,500 words is not very much. Especially there are 100 different ways you can write this essay. There's no perfect essay. You're going to have to decide what you're going to argue because there are lots of possibilities. So it's an essay where you better spend time thinking and rereading before you actually start and then do a plan. As I said, 1,500 words is not very much. And there are lots and lots of different ways of doing it. Any questions?
Do we need to reference other works?
No. No. In fact, referencing, given there are only two texts, just do footnotes or in notes to anything you quote or as a direct reference to either Conrad or Nietzsche, but referencing is not that important in this exercise because there are really only two texts. I mean, you've only got 1,500 words. If you want to bring in something else from the course or from outside, you're welcome to do that, but I think it's a bit risky. I mean, you can certainly make parallels with Hamlet or searches. There's all sorts of ways of doing that that might help the argument.
Is it 1,500 words plus or minus 10%, or what's the? You've said so no more than 1,500.
Well, I'm not going to do a count, and the moment it's 1,500 words, stop reading. But no more than 1,500 words.
Does it go in Turnitin?
Yes. If you have, I mean, Turnitin's been giving us a huge amount of trouble this year. If you have trouble with Turnitin, don't worry. Just put it in hard copy. But don't waste time or worry about not getting turned into function. I'm not a great believer in Turnitin. It assumes that
are there
plagiarists.
Any requirements between second and third year?
No. No.
Ever.
Ever. No. No, whatever anyone says. I mean, I will take account, I will have an eye a little bit on what's second and what's third year, but the essay is going to be judged in itself as an object. Clearly, you need clear argument. Decide what you're going to argue, whatever. There's no, as I said, there's no correct answer. And argue clearly and illustrate well. The only requirement. Not difficult. Once you've got on top of the Heart of Darkness and you've got some confidence with Nietzsche, because I don't think anyone will get better than some confidence with Nietzsche, then just work out what themes you want to focus on and let them run your essay. Yeah?
So we were okay to use secondary sources as well, like other people's views?
If you want to, you don't need to, that's all I'm saying. You can. I don't think it's going to help, because there isn't. Well, I mean, there is some literature on Nietzsche and Conrad, but I don't think it's going to help much. It's more likely to distract you. You know, I know there are anxious moments in preparing an essay. You think, oh, if only I read more. Or if I go and read this and I read that, everything's going to be solved. In the main, you're just going to be wasting your time and energy doing that. You better just to reread and rethink. Just think more. So sit with it, digest it. A bit like trying to digest a bad meal. Hope that something in your stomach's going to function.
I have another class planned with me. Are we talking Conrad next week?
No, we're talking Conrad when the essay's due. We're going to film next week. We're not talking about Conrad before the essay's due. So Conrad's in 3 weeks' time, when we will be talking about Heart of Darkness. We've got Misfits next week, which has good parallels with Heart of Darkness. And then we'll be looking at paintings the week after. Then you can run it as an initiation. You can write an essay on initiation using these two texts. There's all sorts of possibilities. But we'll keep it nice and simple. When you ideally don't bring too much in, don't get too complicated, try and keep it simple. I mean, you'll need to read Heart of Darkness just to get a sense of the text, as you do with Hamlet, but this is actually a lot easier than Hamlet. Or it seems a lot easier, but actually not. And then reread. Those of you who know Fight Club well and have thought about it, that actually will be a help. Or it should be a help. But I wouldn't now go away and spend 3 days rewatching Fight Club. You're better off to read Heart of Darkness. Anyone else? So the reason for the absolute deadline is we will be talking about Heart of Darkness that day in 2 weeks' time. What it's really about. Or some of the things it's really about. There's a lot in it.
I foresee a lot of anxiety. Like, oh
That's
no,
all right.
I didn't include that in my list.
Fear and anxiety for you. It's got to be put to good use. It's paralysing. It's initiation. This is the word for initiation. But unless there's a moment of horror, of shock, what am I going to do? I can't do this. It's a sort of death experience. You're actually not going to write a good essay. You sort of shrug your shoulders, this is a breeze. It's not going to be a good essay. In Heart of Darkness, and it's true with all stories, you need to be the central character Marlowe going up a river. And you put yourself in his shoes. Into the Heart of Darkness.
Or in Conrad's head.
Maybe, if you can, that's harder. It's hard to work out what's going on in Conrad's head. Yeah, but if you can get yourself into the head of the author. Conrad had a sort of breakdown around this period, so perhaps understand the text. Just as Nietzsche went mad. A good bit later in the tragedy. All right, another challenging text, Ekalavya. The rest of our discussion. This is from the Indian archetypal story, the most important Hindu myths, called the Mahabharata. A lot of stories, this is just one of them. So you want to guess off what's going on here. There are a lot of affinities between Western culture and Hinduism, by the way. So it's probably a lot closer to the Aboriginal mythology. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, it's just a fact. Okay, Ekalavya. And archery. Have you got any archers in the room? Anyone who can bow and arrow?
I mean, I find a bow and arrow, but I don't know.
You couldn't weave a poem with 7 arrows to muzzle a dog.
I could be the target.
Puzzling story.
He makes a supreme sacrifice because of devotion to the master, to a higher order.
So he makes, Ekalavya himself makes a supreme sacrifice. He cuts off his right thumb, which means he won't fire an arrow ever again, out of devotion to his master. The master asks him to do it. Why does the master ask him to do it? The one, his teacher, who actually hasn't taught him.
Because his star pupil is mixed, that there's someone better than him.
His star pupil, Arjuna, is, and reminds the teacher, Drona's the teacher, reminds him, you once promised that you would make me the greatest archer of all, and here, this Ekalavya, he's obviously better than me, probably better than I'm ever going to be. So he insists.
He's of low caste.
And there's a caste thing, that Arjuna is upper caste, high caste, Brahmin, and Ekalavya is one caste down, inferior caste. Another reason that Drona can't teach him, part of the caste system.
I saw the cutting off of the thumb as a restorative order, in a sense. Because Ekalavya was never meant to be what he wants to aspire to be. So ruining his archery ability makes Arjuna what he was supposed to be.
What he was supposed to be according to the promise of Drona.
Yeah.
So sort of one reading is a restoration of order, so that Arjuna will be the greatest archer.
But where was Ekalavya in the caste?
One down.
So he was...
One level down. He's not an untouchable. No, Arjuna's warrior. He's, they call him the Shadas. Anyone know the actual? But he's one caste down.
Oh, from Arjuna?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so he
he's
was...
a sort of second level of the caste system. Arjuna's the top. Arjuna's the prince. I'm the prince. So there is a caste issue here.
A big part of the story was he didn't actually need the master's tuition to learn well. It was that devotion and determination.
Yeah, so we've got Ekalavya comes, he's great, he wants to be an archer, comes to the greatest teacher of archery, Drona, and Drona refuses to teach him. For caste reasons, can't teach him.
That's what you said. You said because you're not a warrior.
You're not a warrior, you're not the warrior caste.
Yeah.
It's a caste reason. Indian. I won't teach you archery, even though you want to learn it. Where Ekalavya goes off into the jungle by himself, and he teaches himself with the help of
The mud image or his form of the guru.
he creates what a mud. What is it? He makes a figure of Drona out of mud with his own hands. He called this image his guru. Daily he would worship this image and then practice on his bow. In a short while he found he could learn archery quickly. Such is the magnetism of desire. So he builds a mud fetish or statue, crude statue presumably out of mud, which he worships as his teacher, and this allows him to learn archery very, very quickly.
Wasn't it in the likeness of...
He made a figure of Drona.
Yeah.
Yes, in the likeness of Drona.
So he didn't really need going himself, it's the idea of.
It seems he didn't need the actual teacher.
Needed
You would
that.
normally
He
expect
still-
you would need the teacher
Yeah.
to teach you the actual techniques
Which
of
is why
archery.
Jonah may have been a little bit peeved at the end when I had to cut his thumb, because it's like cutting him down a little bit, saying, well,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, you teach it was
Oh, yeah,
superfluous.
where are you going?
Yeah,
Live on your own.
Yeah, that you're probably a better archer than I drone around.
So the need for a teacher can be an illusion.
In this case, the need for a teacher is an illusion, it seems. Does this make sense or not? Or is it just incomprehensible? We've got any, can we think of any parallels? Learning archery, teaches himself in the jungle by himself to be the greatest archer of all, and all he's got is a mud image of his teacher in front of him, which he worships. He's got reverence. He's got devotion and reverence. There's no doubt about that. And focus on archery.
And time.
Time. He's got all the time in the world.
It made me think of some of the sort of the New Age teachings where they say that if you would, what is it, the secret of attraction, where you attract what you focus your attention on. So in this case, all one's conscious and unconscious thoughts are drawn towards this one desire, and you'll achieve it.
Mm-hmm. Plausible.
A kind of self-hypnosis.
It's like a religious worship, though. Worship of an idol, God.
Yeah.
You can sort of see it's a little bit like this.
Except he's actually doing practical things, isn't he? He's practicing.
As well.
He's learning to fire arrows.
I think it's something that human beings do a lot, where they tend to give the credit to a god or a supernatural entity, but really they've done the hard work themselves to attain whatever result.
Well, you could, if you read it that way, you could just see this as a device for focusing his mind.
Yeah.
The mud idol.
I'm a bit sceptical of weaving 7 arrows to form what he did, but I think that's the essence of the story. Well, that was my interpretation of it.
A lot of events at the Olympic Games or sport at its best creates beautiful, what the Greeks used to call beautiful rhythms, sort of aesthetic masterpieces. So this is a bit in that tradition. That if someone is just so good with the bow and arrow.
I like that Ekalavya didn't even seem to realise how great an archer he was. He had this mastery, he had this skill, but he didn't actually realise.
That's not the point of archery for him.
No.
What is the point of archery for Ekalavya? I mean, he's got one desire, which is to become a great archer. He becomes a great archer. Doesn't even understand how great he is. He doesn't have any actual lessons.
He wants to be a disciple.
Part of him wants to be a disciple, but not in order to learn, because he learns without his teacher. So is the message, one of the messages that, if you really want something, you probably think you need a teaching, but you actually don't. You just need to focus. You need the magnetism of desire, to quote the story, to become excellent. What about him? He's off in the jungle by himself. He looks like a wild animal. He's dressed in, when they meet him, he's dressed in the skin of a leopard. So we've got the wilderness, the uncivilized, the untamed, and the opposite of a class in which there's a teacher. The Dionysian.
So to be able to teach himself archery, he had to undo his previous conditioning of the belief that he needed a teacher. And
Yes.
that's the diagnosis.
And he had to separate himself from human society
Yeah.
and focus totally on archery. Do a bit of Don Bradman using a stump to hit a tennis ball. Thousands and tens of thousands of times against a wall.
I was thinking when reading it that maybe sometimes to become better at something you need to go away and learn a different way to do it because he's not taught.
Mm-hmm.
So in that manner he becomes the best by teaching himself and discovering through his own methods.
Yep.
I guess maybe a new way to do something.
Yep. So the obvious path is closed to him, so it
Yep.
forces him onto a different path.
Well, if you don't know how good you are, you're going to keep trying to be better. Like that ego thing.
Maybe it's ego. We don't know with him. He's an artist too, isn't he?
But
He's
he's
creating
not.
beautiful works.
He's also not given any constraints because he
Yeah,
doesn't have a teacher, isn't it?
That's what I mean. Because he's on his own, he doesn't actually know how good he really is because there's no one else around him. It's just not a comparison or anything. So he's just going to keep practicing and keep getting better, though he may not know how good he is.
Does he care how good he is?
I don't think so. If he cares, would he give up his phone so easily?
Didn't seem to express any jealousy either.
Yes, exactly. There's no jealousy for Arjuna. It's not like we're envy of Arjuna and his favourite place is the disciple of Drona. Whereas Arjuna does have envy. He envies Ekalavya. Arjuna's a sort of normal, envious, petty human, isn't he? There's ego there. Is Arjuna going to feel bad in the future? Because it's really his envy that's forced Ekalavya to maim himself.
That could be the classic moral ending, isn't it, where Arjuna really needed to learn from the master.
Maybe, if he's awoken to that law.
Yeah.
The last line, Drona and Arjuna walk silently back to the camp. And maybe there is some sense of shame.
Okay, so I understand the story, but if Ekalavya was so good, couldn't he theoretically learn to arch without his thumb?
That occurred to me too.
I think the implication is no.
Because like if you cut it off at like where this is, you'd still have the curve, which you need, I guess. But
I think you're trying to rationalise.
I don't think that's the point.
Finding it hard to accept the loss.
yeah. A little bit, yeah.
Well, exactly. And then from a Western perspective, it's, he's, 20 years old, 25 years old, he could win Olympic gold medals, he could become famous, he could go around the world making beautiful poems out of arrows, and he's just completely ended this.
But he's not a warrior, so presumably he couldn't use his skills. They were not useful to him if he couldn't go soldiering.
But it's his love. Archery is his love. It's who he is. I am Ekalavya the archer. It's almost sort of in the... I mean, if you think it's like an Olympic athlete, you devote so much time, your whole life is focused on becoming the best at diving or hockey or whatever it happens. But you get there, and then the moment you're there, you cripple yourself so that there'll be no money, there'll be no glory, there'll be no gold medals, it defies the Western sense, doesn't it, of what's going on.
Couldn't understand the teacher asking that sacrifice of him.
Mm-hmm.
To give up his, his skills.
Yes, yeah. And does he betray his mission as a teacher, his oath as a teacher? So partly does, doesn't he?
And he almost concretes that part of the story that you don't need a teacher because he actively damages that he's learning to be the best archer. So he's just made that even more concrete that the teacher's irrelevant.
Yeah, yeah. It's only responsibility to students as your best student.
Yeah.
He breaks. He transgresses the law.
Going back to the love, like his archery, like I think his higher love is of Drona. Because he doesn't seem to have any qualms about giving up his thumb. It's just, I'll just do what Drona tells me.
So his higher level is of Drona. And he gets down on his knees 2 or 3 times before Drona and the story.
Rests the thumb.
And
his feet as well.
Rests the thumb, the leading digit, at the feet of Drona.
It's interesting that he washes his feet with his tears as well. Maybe some parallels to the Magdala.
Yeah, but you get a sense that Jesus is worthy of that, don't you?
Whereas Drona's not.
No, and that's what makes you walk away.
love for Jonah then?
Maybe it's go on.
I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I think the point is more that his love started off as archery and Drona, but really he reached a point of higher, I don't know how to articulate it, but some sense of himself that was above that and higher than that, and he was able to sacrifice his son without any doubts because he reached that higher phase.
So sort of his love for Drona maybe represents an attachment to a sort of order or higher order, and it's not for Drona even he hardly knows Drona. But his devotion to Drona is just a bit like the mud idol. It's a sort of device for devotion to hierarchy or order, or and then back with where you started, the restoration of order.
So I also thought there was an element, like I'm not sure what happens before this story or whatever, but we don't know what motivates his desire. It's just there.
No, it's just there.
It's like...
But we don't know what motivates anyone's desire, do we? It's either there or it's not there.
I thought it was like a cultural thing, something bigger than him. We don't know what it is. It's just there in him, in a way.
If you're born with a sort of passion for playing the flute or passion for whatever, the desire's there, but that's just you, isn't it? Ekalavya is just the person with this desire to become an archer.
And there is something about he didn't know he was that good an archer, but he was still so okay with giving that up, that there is something quite superior in that.
There's a higher obedience in that I don't need to show off as an archer. That he's able to transcend his attachment to archery, to glory, to even making beautiful things.
He's the most humble character in the story.
Yes,
but yet he's the best at what he does.
No,
Isn't there a quote that Nietzsche made about the best art and music is one that comes from gratitude?
Yes, yeah. And his Ekalavya is a very good example of gratitude. Yes, exactly. He also fits with Nietzsche in the annihilation of the eye. The normal ego attachment will be to how good I am as an archer, and the beautiful poems I can make with arrows. He's above that. He's detached. He's got some sort of... the oath he's made, or what he obeys, is something higher or beyond, which means he doesn't have the slightest doubt about cutting off his thumb, maiming himself. Which he becomes the teacher at that point.
Yes. Jesus going to the cross, perhaps.
Maybe he's like a Jesus figure, the sort of self-sacrifice. Like Jesus is complaining and cursing and my God, why have you forsaken me? There's a lot more resistance with Jesus than with Ekalavya. Ekalavya cuts it, puts it there, and that's the end of the story.
Well, it was only a thumb.
Yeah. He wasn't dying.
It does raise again, when we started this with Ethan, who is he? What's the nature of the I? What's the identity here? You know, the searchers have started with the question, he's a big man who's violent, who's going to restore order. But by the end, you've got all sorts of other questions. Is he someone who's fulfilling his fate? Is he just big shoulders? You know, what's actually going on? What's the meaning in this story? Does anyone know the Shane Gould story? This story, she's brilliant. Olympics, so she's the only one who won gold medals at all of the 1970s Olympic Games. And it was a very poor period in Australian sport. And she retired after one Olympic Games. And then took to teaching. There might be, you might find partial parallels to Ekalavya.
What was her name?
Shane Gould, Jould, Shane. There have been various documentaries on her.
But a lot of sports people prefer to try and retire when they're at the top, rather than go into that decline.
Yes, that's true. That wasn't really her. She was young. It was she only had one Olympic Games.
What
so
was her reason for?
As far as I remember, she just didn't want to do it. I think.
Okay.
She didn't. I can't remember the detail.
There's probably lots of unappealing parts to that existence as well. And people have to be quite driven to do it, to want to do it, and accept the unappealing parts, I guess.
So that's not Ekalavya though, is it?
No.
Archery's got symbolic stuff in all sorts of mythologies, not least in Zen archery. There's something going on here with human capacity to do things that are beautiful, that sort of transcend the normal clumsy self in great works or beautiful works. Suddenly, this is an individual. He's more than his animal self. He looks like a leopard. And often there's a view, I think it's in our world, it certainly was in the ancient Greek world, it's in those moments that you transcend your normal human self. There's moments of brilliance or glory or excellence. You write a great essay on the Heart of Darkness. Which actually will, if you do manage it, you will bring us a special sort of fulfillment and satisfaction, whether I didn't think I could do that, or it's better than my normal self. We all know that experience on one front or another. This is sort of, as clumsy creatures as we are, there are moments of perfection. And Ekalavya is partly a story about perfection. Why is the muzzling the dog? What is the dog about? Is it barking dog? What does that represent? Any dog lovers amongst us? You can perhaps tell us what's going on here. Is there any significance on it being a dog in the story? It's ugly, discordant, noisy. Yeah. Anxious, frightened. Actually, the dog's Arjuna, isn't it? Isn't the symbol here for Arjuna? Envy is yapping away. Actually, and Arjuna's scared. What? Ekalavya, how's he become this good? Something intimidating about this degree of perfection. It's unnatural, or back to nature, something unnatural about this. So maybe it's in right order that he maims himself. It's too perfect, it's too good.
I was wondering about the dog myself, but I only thought of it as, catalyst for what undoes Ekalavya in the end. He doesn't know any of this will happen. Like he wouldn't know that
No,
it would
it's-
lead to his...
Yeah, no, it's completely unself-conscious.
Yeah.
It's just what he does.
Yeah.
He says fun with arrows. Yeah, muzzling the dog.
Could it have anything to do with muzzling your ego? Could
Yeah.
the dog represent ego in some way?
Yeah, yeah, I think it does. And certainly the uncontrolled passions, the sort of Dionysian passions, it's an Apollo image, isn't it? The beautiful poem in arrows, muzzling the howling dog. It'd be a very good essay if anyone can bring us into Heart of Darkness. Smile like the central character there would really like to be Ekalavya, I think.
Is that a challenge?
Yes. Prose poem. What's he going to do for the rest of his life, too? His one passion was archery. It's now... It's over.
Living spiritual bliss.
There's
Or
no...
contentment. I guess there was just the idea that he would be content.
Or will he become passionate about something else?
Yeah.
Because it's actually the fact of being passionate, not necessarily just the action of archery. It's about
Or teach his skills to other people.
teach his skills, except the part of the story is that there's no point in teaching.
Yeah.
He didn't have a teacher.
Yeah, I felt like it was more be likely that he just moves through life with that passion and a sense of not being attached to being good so much as it being about the passion, the journey of the passion.
There's some areas, aren't there, some skills that do need teaching. With training the voice. You want to become an opera singer.
Using computers.
Using computers, I think you can teach yourself that. Put your mind to it. Or are there not? Can we apply Ekalavya elsewhere? What things absolutely do need training or teaching?
I might with practice, you teach yourself most things, you know.
Yeah. Teach yourself to become a lawyer from law books.
What about medicine though?
But that's how, I mean, that's how people learn.
Yeah.
That would be a bit frightening. A surgeon that taught him.
You practice on animals and corpses.
Yeah, right.
It's possible.
Yeah, it's possible.
It was how surgeons learned.
In the first place.
Yeah, in the first place.
Yeah.
I think it comes down to time too, doesn't it? Like having the time. And I mean, obviously,
Well, that's focus. You've
everyone
always,
in medicine is until the lessons learned, but
if you want to do something, there's always time. That's sort of one thing I've got no time is passionalisation. It means you don't have passion.
yeah.
Is it doing it for the right reason? Like having the reason, like... Because it's obviously not for the glory of being the best. Or else he wouldn't have cared, but he would have cared more about his thumb being cut off. And like Shane Gould, like, she was the best, but then she was very easy just to let it go.
No more gold medals.
It's about something else. It's not about just having the glory. It's the right reason.
So there's sort of unself-conscious love for the art, for the, whether it's swimming or archery. Yes, that's a big part of it. And that's part of the reason that he humiliates Drona and Arjuna, isn't it? There's a sort of purity of motive in Ekalavya, which the other two don't have. I mean, it should be Drona who gets down on his knees in front of Ekalavya, because he's been taught about teaching, about education.
Going back to that point about whether you can teach yourself, I think you could probably teach yourself most things, because it's just if you had the dedication, it's a process of trial and error. So you might start off not knowing, but you try something, oh, that didn't work. Let's try something else. That didn't work. That didn't work. Finally, you know, you will get there.
Anything that doesn't, anything obvious that doesn't fit. So you just need the magnetism of desire, to use the line from Ekalavya.
And to not have the ego attachment.
Yes, and the gratitude. It's an important point that Nietzsche's culture depends on gratitude.
I mean, it might be quicker and easier, and you might learn better ways of doing something by learning from a teacher.
You might.
But it doesn't mean you can't just still learn some level of ability yourself.
And is it, I mean, the ultimate method, what's the ultimate moral here? Is the sort of redemption or a redemptive illusion? Is there something redemptive about Ekalavya? Do you reach a sort of higher understanding, higher peace, or what could you say? Or is it horror? What am I going to do the rest of my life?
It's not horror because he's happy at the end. He's just, you know, I'm happy to give you this Dakshina in return for the art that I learned from you. Here it is. So he sees it as payment. It's
an act of gratitude.
Yeah, act of gratitude. And it's like he's fulfilled his destiny. That I, Ekalavya, was born to become an archer. I became an archer. I reached as high a perfection as I could.
He has inner peace.
He has inner peace. When Ethan rides away at the end of the search, it's a bit similar. It's pretty doubtful whether he has inner peace, but he's actually done what he has to do. The story's over. And he's a bit older.
And what he had to do was a little bit more recent in terms of his peace.
Yeah, well, it's just different.
Yeah.
Very different.
It's more about an ideal, it feels like, than
This. Well, it's groping for if we've taken it out of context. I don't think it violates the story too much, taking it out of the Mahabharata. It's about an ideal of how to live and with ultimate meaning. It's not different than from our other stories. It's just probably the most difficult story in this course in terms of making sense of it. It's a little bit odds with a lot of Western sense of achievement and ego and excellence, why we do things, motive. Although at the end of the Iliad, which is a great work that starts Greek culture, the great warrior Achilles just shrugs his shoulders and says, oh, all my brilliance, all my feats are worthless, they're worth nothing. His sense of everything that he's done is of no significance. He's of grief stricken at the death of his friend.
Is that where the inner peace comes from? He never assumed that what he had to do was of any significance.
Well, I think you say there, if you think your reason you're doing something is that it will have significance, or it will save lives, or it will bring good to humanity, you're mistaken. That's a sidetrack to. This is not about being a good person in terms of saving lives or helping other people, or even creating beautiful poems that will inspire other people, because he cripples his ability to do that anymore. So it's very much against a sort of utilitarian or functional thing. I'm doing this so that I can become great, or so that I can help others. That's not what this is about. It's very much at odds with almost all reasons that we would have for doing things.
It's not personal gain.
It's got nothing to do with personal gain. It's not to do with social gain.
Yeah.
He's not trying to make a better society. He's not trying to become a better person. He's not trying to make a better world. No, it's very tough. You could say he's being true to himself. But the question is, you know, what does that mean? He is being true to himself, Ekalavya.
Similar to the initiation that we give into the boys, is almost teaching them about that, about having respect and about
Devotion.
saying that you're nothing and having that experience. It's, again, you know.
That's true. He sort of teaches Drona and Arjuna that you are nothing.
But he goes through his own initiation first too,
that-
doesn't he?
yeah.
Before it's almost as an initiation becomes their initiation.
Like you have to lose something or feel, have to, I don't know, there's some similar lesson.
But he sort of initiates himself.
But there was suffering in the beginning because although he didn't hold it personally towards Drona, he was unhappy.
Yep, there was suffering in the beginning.
Yeah.
And this is a parable. You know, obviously, it's one of those profound stories which you can read in different ways, and it's hard to put your finger very confidently on what actually is going on. It's an enigma. Sort of parallel, sort of stimulating. It's got something important going on. It's one of those stories where I have a sense of something important going on in this story, and it's actually very hard to put your finger on what it is. I think we might leave it there for today. Words are better.